To get started, I would love for our panelists to introduce themselves to our audiences, what you do, and how are you innovating in the food and beverage sector. We'll pass along.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael. In 2016, I started a company called Spice. Spice is a restaurant automation company. We built automation for restaurants, but we also operated our own restaurant brand. Last year in September, we got acquired by a company called Sweetgreen. If you're in the US, you're familiar. Sweetgreen is a very large restaurant company that sells healthy food with the mission of inspiring people and connecting them to real food and inspiring healthier communities.
Hi, I'm Henry. I'm the founder of Café X. So we make a coffee robot. And if you ever visit the Museum of the Future in Dubai, you can try it out in the cafe that's in the lobby. So the machine just makes like a wide range of drinks that you'd expect to get from a coffee shop. It uses a robotic arm to make the drinks really quickly and accurately. Yeah, hope you get to try it out.
Hi, I'm Joshua Nixon. I'm co-founder of Prime Roots. At Prime Roots, we have a platform that enables us to make really any type of meat or seafood alternative. And we've used that today to innovate in the deli and charcuterie space where there really aren't any existing plant-based meat options. And so I'm unfortunately not able to bring it here today, but I really wish that you all get to try it soon.
Hey everyone, my name's Sam. I'm the co-founder and CEO of OnePointOne. We develop automated vertical farming technology. So essentially we build machines to grow the highest quality plants on earth. Nice to meet you.
Amazing. So now that you're all introduced, we know that sustainability is a buzzword currently. Like it's also one of the 3 themes here at Expo 2020 Dubai. So I want to know, how are you making progress to become more sustainable with your businesses?
You know, I think I'll start out by saying that sustainability and food are so synonymous in a way that everyone needs to recognize much more so. We think of sustainability as electric cars and things like that, but food accounts for somewhere between 20 and 40% of greenhouse emissions. Do y'all have an actual stat on that?
I think it's 15, it's around 20%.
Yeah, I've seen between 15 to 25, where roughly 15 to 25%. It's very hard to estimate these things, of course, in terms of how you do the accounting. But over half of that is actually directly coming from land use changes and the direct emissions of animal agriculture. So that's the lion's share of what's causing those emissions within food.
And so we have a responsibility to address climate change through food. At Spice and at Sweetgreen, we address it through, Sweetgreen is pledged to become carbon neutral by 2027. And that largely comes from a few things, but the biggest one is changes in our supply chain and actually working with suppliers that are using good sustainable practices like regenerative farming. And then the second is building restaurants in a sustainable way.
No, go ahead, mate, go ahead.
Yeah, well, with our coffee robot, it I think generally uses maybe 10 times less water than a normal coffee shop does. So normally a coffee shop will use probably around 2,000 liters of water per day. Our machine will use around 20, just because it doesn't have a lot of these like rinsing processes and cleaning that people have to do after making drinks every time, and like washing dishes and that kind of stuff. And the machine uses fully compostable packaging.
So obviously sustainability is very core to what we do. It's practically our mission. As I mentioned, animal agriculture is over half of the agriculturally related greenhouse gas emissions. We did a life cycle analysis on our products because we want to stay very attuned to what the impact that they cause is. And what we found is that for every kilogram of meat we produce relative to the comparative animal meat, we save 9 kilograms of CO2 emissions for every kilogram. And also, on top of that, we also end up using 1/10 of the water, actually less than 1/10 of the water, and less than 1/10 of the land to produce the same amount of food. And so we're enabling humanity to live with a high population that still continues to grow, but with a much smaller footprint on the earth.
Yeah, so I mean, agriculture is so bad for the earth. So of the land mass around the world, 50% of it is occupied by human beings, and 95% of that is agriculture. The vast, vast majority of the land that is occupied by humans is agriculture. And agriculture consumes 70% of fresh water. It is 70% of freshwater contamination. The list goes on and on and on. So for us, our system uses about 99% less water. It uses about 100 times less land. It has no pesticides. It has no seasonality. Talking about supply chain, we can build the farms right next to where the product is consumed. So sustainability, but it's not a panacea, right? You know, we still use a lot of electricity. Everyone always wants this like panacea, this one solution that solves everything to do with sustainability. But as all of these lads are working on, I think, you know, each of us tackle different problems in different sectors of agriculture, and in the end, we're just trying to push the ball down the field, you know.
And do you think, you know, do we think the biggest challenge, I'm curious, is the biggest challenge changing consumer behavior or changing the behavior of agriculture companies and restaurant companies and other food suppliers? Curious what you think.
I mean, it was the same whale oil back in, I think we spoke about this, whale oil back in the 1850s and 1890s. Everyone's jumping up and down saying, don't use whale oil anymore, don't use whale oil anymore. Did nothing to consumer behavior. They still consumed oil. But when we found oil in the ground, we stopped killing the whales. So the answer to the question is, in my opinion, it's about innovation. The government has a role, certainly, to educate consumers about what they should and should not be doing. But in the end, I think it's innovation. Partly you.
Yeah, and I think you know, it really comes down to is creating food that people actually want to eat at a price that people can actually consume it, right? That's what the technology that we're all working on is really trying to provide. But I think zoning in on the price and what governments can do around that, it's worth noting that today in many countries around the world, the United States especially, meat and animal products are heavily subsidized. And that's to keep their prices affordable for regular everyday consumers. However, there are not similar subsidies for much more sustainable options that people can be choosing. And so I think a very good step we could take is either to equate these subsidies or to completely get rid of them, so that the free market is able to actually drive consumer choice towards sustainable options.
I have one final thing to say on that. In the United States, of all of the dollars that go into a farm, 40% of those dollars come from the US government. These are massive, massive, massive subsidies, and they're towards things like sugar and wheat and corn and soybean, these products that really don't particularly nourish people, particularly in the United States.
I agree, and I think that innovation is important. I do think that there's a huge piece of it is convincing consumers to eat differently, to convincing consumers to eat less meat, convincing consumers to eat more vegetables. And I think that in a way, consumer brands have a responsibility. You know, we were acquired by Sweetgreen, so obviously I'm biased, but I think Sweetgreen has done an incredible job of making healthy food cool. It didn't used to be. You know, like I think back to the ads that we saw as kids with Michael Jordan and McDonald's. That's what was cool back then. And I think that you know, it's like making vegetables cool, I think was a really hard thing, and I admire Sweetgreen a ton because I think they cracked it.
Yeah, it's great to hear the numbers on impact and affordability. We will touch on food prices a bit later, but you know, speaking of third parties and regulation, I want to touch on raising capital. So a common denominator between all of you is that you've raised significant funding. So I want to hear what are some misconceptions and myths that you've encountered, say pitching your business, talking to investors, if you can fill me in on how that's been.
I would say going into it, I think we got a lot of feedback that investors were not going to be interested in investing in a restaurant company since it doesn't have venture returns, that the technology was slow and it was hard, and to an extent all that was true, but I found, at least in Silicon Valley, there was a very, very healthy ecosystem of investors that were very interested in food innovation and food tech. And, you know, it got difficult through COVID when the business was hurting, but I'd say the biggest misconception for me is that if you're not a software business, you can't raise capital. I don't think that's true.
I mean, There's so much ESG money out there right now, and ESG means more than ESG. For us, particularly with us, when you're developing a new system altogether, agriculture is the oldest industry in the world. It's 10,000 years old. When you're trying to innovate in a specific way, you're up against that kind of leverage and momentum. So for us, it was, when we say the words, we're going to reinvent how we grow plants, automatically investors think that's going to cost $500 million. So there's how you phrase things is, I suppose, very important. But like you said, there's money out there for these types of businesses, particularly today.
The other thing to say, I think a lot of this is a timing thing too, because as you mentioned, food is the oldest industry in the world by many measures, right? Agriculture. And disrupting that, I think, is something that's become in vogue to actually fund very recently. Historically, people thought food wasn't changing. People thought that really there wasn't much to be done there, and that it's this very stagnated industry controlled by large conglomerates. However, really with the intersection, I would say, of innovators coming together and realizing how technologies can be applied to food that maybe have existed but haven't been applied in that way. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And as well as the ESG interest coming in and the need for sustainability in the 21st century. Really, those two factors coming together has driven an explosion in food technology over the last 10 years or so. And so I think 10 years prior, 15 years prior, we'd be having a very, very different conversation here with a world that hadn't yet woken up to this need.
Yeah, I would also add that with food, it's just a huge market. All of us are working in market side, from salad greens to deli meats, coffee, and salads and healthy bowls. It's a huge market, and investors know that.
Josh, to your point about there being a disruptive, ecosystem of money coming in, my question is, are there areas where investors are still struggling to understand in food tech, given that there is money coming, money available to spend, but not being themselves experts, subject matter experts, are they still struggling in areas? If you can fill me in.
I would actually say from my perspective, it feels that the place I see investors struggling with lack of knowledge is less on the side of underinvestment in certain areas and technologies, and actually more in the overinvestment in certain areas that don't really have the same pragmatism as others. So there's really a relative basis thing that I'm talking about, and particularly related to our industry and what we work on. There's a lot of companies out there that have gotten a huge amount of funding to grow animal stem cells, and I believe maybe this may one day be possible, but from an economics standpoint, it doesn't really address the same needs. We were talking about how food needs to be affordable, right, for it to be a viable business model. And I think a lot of investors, they don't really understand biology to the degree that they may need to understand which technologies will actually be able to produce affordable food within the next 20 to 30 years.
I think a question to anyone, how do we think going forward we can help address that knowledge gap for investors? Where can we start?
I mean, I think as entrepreneurs who've been fortunate enough to have raised capital, we got to show a return. I mean, investors at the end of the day, if we can produce a healthy return for them, they're going to come back, and other investors look at other success stories. I mean, there have been success stories in probably all of our categories. So I don't know. To me, it seems like the best thing we can do is deliver results.
Amen to that. I mean, that is definitely, I think, the main thing that we can do. I mean, kind of going off of the point that I was making immediately prior to this question, I think we will see over time how these different technologies shake out. We're going to see where people are able to create real achievement and market disruption and where they are not. And I think because food is such a large industry, it's really the antithesis of a winner-take-all industry. We'll continue to see new investment in the areas that people are seeing success, because there's so many different small facets of food that will still need to be disrupted. I mean, nobody wants to eat the same thing every single day. That's just not how humans work.
I think I ate Chipotle every day for 7 years, but maybe I'm just an outlier. For us, I think it's just time with our industry. You know, when I'm trying to talk about aeroponics increasing the transpiration rate of a plant, that takes a while for a Sandhill Road VC to latch onto, but they understand yield differences. So the way that I think that we as entrepreneurs can make these differences, these gaps in knowledge better, is you start with the metric that they can understand, and then you sort of walk back into the technical description of why that is the case. That's the way we found success, I think.
Basically meet them where they are. That helps. Amazing. I want to hear about automation. So all of you have employed or introduced some degree of automation to your businesses. We often hear the negatives, the disadvantages. I want to hear some of the pros. How has deploying automation into your product or service seen growth and benefits? Henry, if you want to take the lead on this.
Sure. So we do both own and operate, where we run the machine and sell coffee, and we also sell it to other businesses or coffee brands. And something interesting we found out is that it's very common for a coffee shop to have over 100% turnover every year. So like their full staff will leave and they have to find new people. And then you have to train the baristas and make sure they're making things well and consistently. And like if you run water into an espresso for like 5 seconds too long, it can taste completely different and terrible. So the training part is very important. And actually today there's already some level of automation in like every single coffee shop. What we do is just kind of finish the rest of that makes the whole system fully automated. We use the robot arm to move cups around, to operate the different machines, make sure you get the correct ingredients. That's automation.
I think the problem is lack of labor. The problem we have in the US, the problem is there isn't enough bloody labor, you know? I mean, if you think about agriculture, the average age of a farm worker is 52 to 54. The average age of a farmer themselves is about 60. And there isn't a bloody generation coming that wants to work out on the farm. And there's a big gap from an automation sense to be able to automate outdoor farms. So the problem is, in my most humble opinion, the problem is not that automation is taking jobs. The problem is we need more automation sooner, particularly in agriculture.
I mean, I think the reason that there's so few people applying for those, it's just such hard work. Has anyone here worked in a restaurant? Cool. Anyone here worked on a farm? It's brutal. It's so hard. A lot of people think automation exists for the bottom line. It doesn't. It's actually the number one reason for it is to make that person's life easier. Like if you can make someone's job easier, you're doing a tremendous amount. And then, the secondary benefits are it can help consumers too by making things faster and more consistent. And then it can help your bottom line as well. But it actually starts with the people. It starts with the actual people and making their lives easier. And in our spice restaurants where we used automation, we had really good retention of our team members. A lot of them, when they would move on, they wouldn't work for another restaurant because they really liked working at our restaurant where it was a little bit slower paced and the work was a little bit easier. And I think that's a huge data point towards automation.
Fascinating. On the same wavelength, so besides automation, what do you forecast within the next 5 to 10 years? How will the food and beverage industry workforce look like, according to you?
All right, fine. From an agricultural perspective, the production of food is going to be heavily, heavily automated. Outdoor farm, greenhouse, indoor farm as well. The workforce is going to become, in my opinion, much sort of higher skilled. So that's, I was going to say in the previous point, the most effective use of robotics is the combination of humans and robots, as opposed to just pure robotics. So I think that the workforce is going to become higher skilled. It's going to be less about doing the monotonous low skilled, sorry to say low skill, high skill, 2022, but it's going to move much more towards higher skill. And there's, in agriculture specifically, think about how many people understand data science and agriculture. There might be like one person in the US that understands data and agriculture, and there aren't many tracks in university to do data science and plant science, you know, so there's going to be a gap here, and you know, it might not be in the front lines right now, but a lot of places on earth are pretty screwed when it comes to food production, if I can be frank.
Yeah, well, I think the role is going to change in coffee shops, cafes, restaurants. So, yeah, I guess most of the hard work, the manual, repetitive, boring processes will be automated, and the staff there will be restocking machines, taking care of them, cleaning them, and serving customers, and just improving the overall experience.
I think the struggle with labor, it's not going to go away. We don't really see a path towards that. I definitely still think there will be people in restaurants, and I still think that the human experience in a restaurant is incredibly important. But I think a lot of restaurants will look towards solutions, whether they be digital, be physical, front of house, back of house, to ease the labor concern.
Yeah, labor is definitely a recurring subject there. I've been reminded of time, but to wrap things up, I feel I really want to touch on the current crisis that's happening, the war. It's been over a month since Russia invaded Ukraine, and although that's caused a catastrophic social, economic, and humanitarian toll, it's also led to a global food crisis. And so, final words: what can we learn and what can we take away from the food crisis that has emerged from this war?
I think the most striking thing to me is how it highlights our dependence on agricultural systems that are based on monocropping in specific areas and dependence on specific crops. So Ukraine produces a huge amount of the world's wheat, but also an even huger amount of the world's sunflowers. It's actually over 90% of the world's sunflowers. And so I actually had an investor, we're raising a Series B round right now, ask me, do we use sunflower oil in our products? Now, luckily we don't. However, they have a company that does use sunflower oil in their products, and they're frantically trying to figure out a new solution because they aren't going to be able to buy it. And so I think it's just really pushing out an awareness of how the drive towards simplicity and efficiency has resulted in an agricultural system where we're very reliant on a very select few number of crops. And there's definitely a need for diversity there. And this is not just from geopolitical risk, but if you look at crop diseases, such as what's happening to the Cavendish banana today, that is also a huge concern for the same type of problem.
In the 70s, there was a agricultural revolution. One of the major parts of that was the Haber-Bosch process, where we figured out how to generate nitrogen. That region of the world generates a lot of nitrogen. If we don't have nitrogen, farms don't grow plants. It's that simple. Nitrogen is the basis of most fertilizers, and it's a key component of growing plants inside of fertilizers. That's one of the reasons why I think some places are screwed. I mean, the United States is in big trouble if this continues and our access to nitrogen is limited in any way. So, yeah, as you were saying before, it just highlights how sort of interdependent we are, and how if we do foresee geopolitical issues, I think the domestication or the nationalization of the production of these kinds of things is super important, for the United States at least.
I mean, I'd say as a restaurant company, we're depending on innovation by y'all to solve some of these problems. So, to an extent, the hardest working team at Sweetgreen is the supply chain team. And that's because Sweetgreen supply chain looks so different from a supply chain of a typical fast food restaurant like a McDonald's. We're sourcing from different suppliers in different markets. So the goat cheese that you buy in Massachusetts is different from the goat cheese you're buying in California, for example. And same with same with a lot of different ingredients. And I definitely think having a distributed supply chain as a restaurant company is becoming more important. As we learned that supply chain turns into a huge risk in a lot of business models.
Definitely some great food for thought there. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for joining us for this very special conversation. I am leaving here enlightened and excited about the future of food, and I hope you are too. Thank you.